Hello, and thanks for listening. I'm Gemma from audiobooks.com, and today we're talking about the newly released audiobook, Soar, Adam Soar, with my special guests, author Rick Prashaw and narrator John Dickhout. Adam Prashaw's life was full of surprises from the moment he was born. Assigned female at birth and with parents who had been expecting a boy, he spent years living as Rebecca Danielle Adam Prashaw before coming to terms with being a transgender man. Adam captured hearts with his humor, compassion, and intensity. After a tragic accident cut his life short, he left a legacy of changed lives and a trove of social media posts documenting his life, relationships, transition, and struggles with epilepsy, all with remarkable transparency and directness. In Soar, Adam Soar, his father Rick retells Adam's story alongside his son's own words. And in the audiobook edition, John brings the book to life with an emotional intensity only possible thanks to his incredible connection to the Prashaw family. John was the recipient of Adam's heart via organ donation after Adam's untimely death. My conversation with them only scratched the surface of their shared story. For more, well, you'll just have to listen to the audiobook. Rick and John, thank you both so much for joining me today. Rick, let's start with you. You say early on in your book that you always knew you'd write a book about your son. Where did that conviction come from?
Well, good morning, John. Good morning, Gemma. I was a journalist. I was a Catholic priest, a storyteller. I had this kid named Adam that doctors identified at birth as a girl, and yet intuitively, especially the mother, but also me, definitely saw at least a tomboy and certainly a boy in progress. So I knew I had a fascinating story. I wanted to tell that story, the pride of being dad to this kid late in life, given my priesthood part of my life. And I just knew that this was a story given his personality, his joy, the journey that he was on. It was something that I wanted to tell.
And you describe writing annual birthday letters to Adam that provided a bit of the basis for your book. But then when did you finally properly sit down to write his story, and what was that process like?
Well, I had retired from my last career, which was a political staff, similar to, like in the States, it would be Congress, but in Ottawa, it was Parliament Hill. So I'd worked for a number of members of Parliament, and I retired, and I had always done writing for bosses, for others, and I was so keen to write for myself. And so I did have those letters. I had probably more significant, as it turned out, Adam's social media and Facebook posts to tell, both in the years identifying as Rebecca and then later in terms of his huge coming out with his post, I am Adam. And so I had all of that material to draw on, and also, of course, the family trips and all the adventures that everyone knows about in their family life. I could talk about what happened in 2016 that completely dramatically shifted the tone of the book. I was in California on a holiday, visiting a sister who happens to be a nurse, and I got the worst call of my life when we learned that Adam, who had a lifetime of dealing with epilepsy and different chapters in that story, and of late, towards 2014-15, really serious, life-threatening seizures, ended up having a couple of brain surgeries in Montreal that looked very promising. But the phone call was from the mother to tell me that he had been found face down in a hot tub. Friends had been with him, but they had left to retrieve some clothes in his apartment. He was resuscitated, and I had to fly home for this weekend vigil to see if we would get the miracle that we were hoping and praying for. And that was not to be, and yet there was to be some life coming out of that tragedy, as Adam was a registered organ donor, and he was able to save 4 lives. And so, as tragic as it was, and as much of grieving, the story started to bubble up inside of me that the lifeline for me was to tell again his entire story, including the gender story, the epilepsy story, but also now a remarkable organ donor part to the book.
And that's where John, the narrator, comes into the conversation. How did you two become connected, and what was that like?
I guess I can take that one.
Sure.
So, the transplant, being a transplant recipient is unlike anything else. And I kind of had this, I was pretty obsessed with wanting to find out whatever I could, if I could, about my donor, this person that gave me my life back. And so pretty soon after I awoke after surgery and realized, hey, I'm alive, and more than alive, more alive than I'd been for a few years prior. I had this immense need or desire to share my gratitude somehow, if I could. Soon found out that wasn't really promoted. In fact, I remember my post-transplant coordinator at one time when I said, well, I want to, how do I find out, blah, 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 and said, John, you'll never know who your donor was. You can send an anonymous letter, and which I did, of course. But I remember in my head thinking, oh, yeah, well, we'll see about that. So I sent an anonymous letter just to somehow try to put into words the immense gratitude I was feeling toward my donor, and of course my donor's family, who made the decision at a very trying time to grant their wishes of their loved one to be an organ donor. And I wasn't necessarily expecting, certainly hoping, but not expecting to get a letter in return, but I did. And in that letter, which was just full of love and sorry, and overwhelming gratitude toward me for having reached out, and I was pretty stunned. But also there were a lot of clues, which I think the Trillium Gift of Life Network maybe and Adam had a hand in letting slip through. But there were a lot of clues about this wonderful young man who was my organ donor. And so I just went to the Google machine and plugged in a few keywords from this marvelous letter that I received. And the first thing that popped up was an obituary. And I could tell immediately that it was written by the same hand as the person who'd sent me this wonderful letter. So I contrived a plan. I wanted to respect their anonymity and privacy. And so I did remain anonymous for as long as I could until it was absolutely certain that my organ donor, which turned out to be Rick, wanted to connect. So, and we can get into the details of how I did that, but short story, I created a fake Facebook page called Heart Recipient and sent him an anonymous note and went from there.
It's a pretty incredible story. The likes that I've certainly never heard of in my years learning about audiobooks. And so once you two got connected and Rick, you understood John's background, did you always have him in mind to narrate the book?
In terms of my writing it?
Like when the book was going to be made into audio, did you have John in mind from the start?
Oh, well, first of all, in the book tour that I did and all over couple of provinces, out to California, in Vermont. Everybody wanted to know, is there an audiobook? And I said, well, no, there isn't. I don't think there's one. I don't think our publisher really has that side of their platform. And then I started also talking to young people, and sometimes those people like Adam with learning disabilities that immediately wanted an audiobook. So when finally Dundurn publisher was able to identify Tantor Media to do the audiobook, I think for about 5 seconds I said, oh, I really want to do this myself. This would be such an experience for me. I've never done this. And that thought left me in about 10 seconds when John pops into my head. And I said, well, he'd be the perfect choice. I mean, we were now friends. We knew each other, families. I was very aware of his golden attitude. I knew he was a community theater actor. I knew he had seized on his desire to be a professional actor. So I knew he had the skills. I can joke on the good days that he had his heart in it, for sure. And I said, he's just so perfect. And of course, then being a professional product, he had to go out and earn it and do the audition and everything.
Yeah, so I heard you did have to audition for the role, John.
Yes, yeah, which was...
And this was your first time narrating an audiobook, is that right?
It was, yeah. I had a couple samples that I had, for my agent, had put together, and I did have one previous audition that I didn't land, but this was the first one I actually got the gig.
So what was it like recording it? Were you surprised by anything during the recording process?
The only surprise, I have a very makeshift sound booth in my home, and of course, largely because of COVID, there wasn't going to be any going into a studio, although we could have done that if necessary. But so I put my makeshift cubicles, and I'm from the old call center world previous to my acting career, and so I got hold of some cubicle walls and built this little makeshift studio. And one thing that surprised me is how bloody hot it got after 8-hour days. So, anyway, but no, it was, yeah. I mean, the process itself was very interesting to me. You're live basically with the engineer who's putting it together as you go. And I guess the one thing I've found surprising is how difficult it is to say an entire sentence without stopping, and how many times you stop and start again. And in fact, I hear it when I listen to the book now that the first couple of chapters are me finding my rhythm a little bit. But that was an interesting part. I always thought I was a pretty and yeah, that was the most interesting, I guess, part of the process. The most nerve-wracking part is thinking about what all those people to whom the book means so much and so many different things, how they would accept it, and how I could possibly do justice to their memories, particularly those people that know Rick and Suzanne and all of his family and of course Adam, and to try to put a voice to what they already have in their heads was, yeah, a little bit daunting.
And so, Rick, for you, what was it like to hear John bring the book to life?
I rely on Adam's family and friends, and they just rave about John and the voice and the telling of the story. So he certainly has no worries. He shouldn't have any worries. The people that really know the story, know my boy, are just, thrilled, with the audiobook.
And certainly, John, your narration brings an extraordinarily personal element to the audiobook. What do you think really elevates the audio experience, perhaps not above print, but certainly as a wonderful companion?
Yeah, so I mean, really, for me, knowing that, I feel anyway, for the listener, that just knowing that story, or maybe discovering the story as it unfolds, but on its own lifts the the senses, I suppose. That's another interesting thing. The engineer who recorded the audio book with me wasn't aware. He knew that Rick and I had a connection, but he didn't know what it was until we got to those chapters in the book. So it was pretty neat to experience that with someone who's hearing it for the first time. So yeah, I think that's, it's hard it's going to mean different things, and it's going to touch different people in different ways. But I certainly think if you've got a heart, it'll probably mean something to you.
Mm-hmm.
Gemma, I get notes. One of the great surprises as an author that I hadn't anticipated, I get notes from strangers, and they tell you what the story does, what this boy does, and so sometimes, when you're a publisher, they all want to know what section of the bookstore, what's the hashtag to use here, and for sure, there's a gender story. He was this tomboy that was like Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, or Tatum O'Neal played that pitcher in Paper Moon, very much looked like those two characters. So there's the gender story, there's the epilepsy story, there's the organ donor story, but there's the family acceptance of this kid. And then somebody finally, one of the podcasters said, it's a love story. And that's what I like the best to hear, that it's a love story, not just of people like family and parents and friends, for Adam, but it's Adam's love for himself, where he had the courage and the resiliency to be who he was and to love who he wanted to love. And he was going there, and nothing was going to stop him. And those are the notes I get from people, either the kids that are struggling with some of these challenges to be loved and not to be hated or hurt out there, or sometimes the parents who need, everybody says, "Oh, you're such a good dad." I said, "Yeah," with about 10,000 screams that are in the book and that I talk about, and some of my mistakes that I make. And Adam is the co-author, which people love because I put a lot of Adam's Facebook post in there, and people just delight in turning to, hearing the next Facebook post from Adam. So it's parents wrestling with these issues, and because of my faith background, I'm also able to address that, and how I have no problems with the divine being that completely blesses this and completely accepts all of this. So there's just so many angles and so many audiences out there for the story.
And with that, with everything you've just touched on, with all parts of Adam's journey, and the challenges that he faced in his life, it really shines through in the book, his resilient spirit, how determined he was to live life to the fullest. And I wonder what lessons, as we close out our conversation here, what lessons you might draw for us from his life as the world moves collectively through this time of hardship. What would Adam have to say about this right now?
Well, if that's for me, I in the book and in the story, share this irrepressible kid, this mischievous kid. There was a shyness to him, but he delighted to be the center of attention, actually. So I just chuckle in the good days about, Adam getting the biggest kick out of a book written about him, an audiobook, that John is the voice. I just, as a dad, I think that's where I go to enjoy thinking about Adam, watching all of this from his place now, that he would enjoy the he would enjoy the celebrity and the attention of it, and it would be always from the fun perspective, because no matter how many times life knocked him down, it was always get back up and like, what's next? Let's go to a sunny place. He'd whine for a day on Facebook, and then he'd be back in his happy place. And so I just can't see him, even though I am the one in the grieving and the loss, and I know how permanent that is for people who do lose their children at whatever age. He didn't stay with us long enough. I want him with us, but I take enormous comfort in Adam, in thinking of Adam being so happy in terms of his story being out there.
We'll leave it there. Thank you, Rick and John, for sharing with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The audiobook edition of Soar, Adam Soar, is available now on audiobooks.com.